Thank you, Richard, and welcome to this discussion. It's really quite an honor for me. I'm a big fan of your work, as you may have read a number of my emails in the past, and I think you have a really very conversational style of writing, and that's at the same time witty and insightful. And which makes it really a joy to read, and quite entertaining at times as well. I guess the first question I would have for you is, how did you discover you were a writer, and how did you get started in this?
Well, Eugene, that's very kind of you to say all those nice things about me. You don't have to, but it's always nice to hear that. Well, I think the first time I really realised that I could write was when I was preparing for my final examinations at Oxford, and you have to write your final exams. There are 11 of them. Each one is 3 hours, and that you do it morning, afternoon, with no break at all. But I found it very easy to actually write, and in fact, I was very interested that when the grades came through for the individual papers, I did best on the papers that I knew least about, which has to mean that there was something going on in terms of the ability to write that excused my lack of knowledge. And then when I went to business school in my early 20s, I went to Wharton, and I ended up as the editor of the Wharton Journal, which was the MBA newspaper essentially. And I wrote a column called Quaaludes and Red Wine, despite the fact that I never ever consumed a Quaalude and actually rather disapprove of drugs, but I certainly don't disapprove of red wine. I had a lot of that. And the whole point about the column was that it was meant to be not dull, because an awful lot of business stuff is dull. So I, deliberately spiced it up, and I invented things. I invented conversations between people as a form of satire. It was fun. And I have a very low boredom threshold. So if I write something and I'm not interested in it, I just can't do it. And if I read something that is boring, I just can't continue with the book, even though it's highly recommended, and it might be an absolutely excellent book. So, if I don't want to bore myself, why should I possibly bore my readers? So I do try quite hard to make it interesting. And when I review it, I don't always write interesting stuff. And when I review it and it's and I think it's boring, then I just start again. So that's really the background. And it's quite interesting. I think most business books are very, very dull, but there are some which are excellent, and they tend to be those who are written by journalists or by people who are very unconventional thinkers. So, for example, Malcolm Gladwell, who is a New Yorker journalist, writes excellent books. And it isn't so much that they're wonderfully insightful. They're not bad, but the stories in them are so well told and so well chosen that you forget that he didn't actually come up with the insight in the first place, but they are an absolute joy to read. And then there's our friend Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who makes a point of writing his books in, I can't describe it. It's partly academic sort of style, and it's partly Brooklyn slang. And it works. It's amazing, actually. And he's extremely rude about a lot of people, including Nobel Prize winners and other eminent personages. And some people say that they can't stomach the books because he's so egotistical. But I think he's so egotistical. He's egotistical to the point that you can't possibly believe that he believes it. And therefore, he must be setting us up, and he must be having a bit of fun. And so I give him a pass on that. I think he's great. And earlier, if you go back to someone like Peter Drucker, Peter Drucker built a reputation as being the best business writer for decades. And really, if you look at it, it's pretty thin stuff, but it's so well written that again, you forget that. And I'd just like to put in a plug for a book that I think is hugely underrated, and a person who, as a business writer, is hugely underrated. And that's a guy who rejoices in the name of Walter Kiechel, Kiechel III. And I think you have to be a very brave person to put the third on your book, although Americans, as you know, are quite weird in some respects. And he wrote a book about the Lords of Strategy, which includes bits on my old mentors, Bill Bain of Bain and Company and Bruce Henderson of BCG. And they are so well written. And actually, he also has gone and interviewed. He couldn't interview Bruce because I think he was dead by the time he wrote the book. But, you know, the interviews on which he based this were clearly very, very detailed and very long and very well prepared. And then he just writes absolutely wonderful prose. So if anyone's interested in the whole idea of strategy or business ideas and is listening to this podcast, I'd recommend that book, The Lords of Strategy, subtitled The Secret Intellectual History of the New Corporate World. But I think he's actually onto something. So anyway, I'll give a plug for him. So anyway,
go ahead.
Indeed,
quite an exciting read, that one, for sure, yes. Go ahead. I was interrupting.
No, not at all. That's your job. You're meant to be interviewing me. This is not meant to be a monologue. No, it's interesting that all of the people that I mentioned, with the possible exception of the last one, write in hyperbole. I mean, Peter Drucker really was almost like a Marxist propagandist. I mean, he has 5 things of that and 7 things of that and all the rest of it. And it's pure journalism. And he will say, nobody believes that, you know, whatever it is. Well, actually, a lot of people do believe that, but he's always writing in an extreme form. And I think that's true. That's true also of Taleb. And I do that, and I try and moderate that a bit. But you have to understand that business writers who want to be individualists are struggling against well-meaning editors. My editors are very good, but it doesn't matter. I've written for probably about 5 different publishing houses, and whether they're based in the US or the UK or anywhere else, they are always trying to get you to be quasi-academic. They always insist on references. You know, you can't say anything without adding a reference. And they all tend to tone down anything which is too idiomatic and sort of put it into business speak. And so, you know, they change it that way, and then I change it back to what it was originally.
The individualistic kind of style of is kind of driven out that way as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. But anyway, that's my diatribe against my publishers. Probably no one will publish a book by me again. That's fine. Okay, shall we move on to your next question?
Yes, it's interesting what you say. There's only a few things that you like to write about and read as well. So it kind of harks back to the 80-20 principle, if you will, and that's kind of the next kind of section of this discussion I'd like to have is, obviously it's not new. Pareto came out with the notion, but you've taken it a lot further, and you from economics to business, investing, lifestyle, etc. So you've really delved really deep into what Alfredo kind of observed, and so that's what I take from you is it's really been much more enriching in that way. And how did you go about delving so deep?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that, but I think it's very accurate as well. There's an amusing little anecdote behind that, which is that it wasn't my idea to write a book on the 80-20 principle. I had an editor who at that time was working for Pittman, or it later changed its name to various other things, but they were basically a training and I suppose course-based publisher when it came to business. His name was Mark Allen, and he said to me, I think you should write a book about the 80-20 principle. And that's because I'd written an A to Z of management terms, and the 80-20 principle had half a page. And I said to him, Mark, I've written half a page on the 80-20 principle. If I really padded it out, I might write a full page or 2 pages. In fact, if I went completely mad about it, I might even be able to write a chapter. But there's no way I could write a book about it. There's just not enough to say. And it was quite interesting that when I he said, no, have a go at doing it. And he was quite right. The more I dug into it, the more I found it was actually a very, very deep concept. And also, in some ways, a very obvious concept. I mean, I think Goethe said, things that are unimportant must not be at the mercy of things that are important. In a way, that was, that was 100 years, not quite 100 years before even Pareto was writing back in 1896. And but on the other hand, that's absolutely right. It's funny that in our lives we don't realize, or we forget, of course we sort of understand it at one level, that there are some things which are profoundly important, and there's a mass of other stuff which is actually trivial. And so, you can reduce the meaning of life to, a few things like, are you healthy? Do you have enough money? Or can you do the things that you want to do with money? Do you have a loving relationship? Do you have a good family life? Do you exercise to keep yourself healthy and also for enjoyment purposes? Do you have some other leisure pursuit which is engrossing for you and which enriches you and perhaps tops up your imagination a bit? And are you fulfilled at work? Now, those are very, very few things. I defy anyone to say that there's something else that I've left off that list which is hugely important. And can you think of anything else that I've left off? Maybe I have.
No, I think it's the basic comforts of life, isn't it? Having a happy life. I think that's what it really comes down to is having a fulfilling and happy life.
Yeah.
So that's health, that's wealth. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the key insight on the 80-20 principle is the imbalance that exists in life between what we should be doing in our own interests and what we do. And so, if time is such a wonderful example, we know that we have a limited amount of time and life energy. That's the one thing which, basically gets exhausted and we die. So we know time and life energy are kind of important, but we all spend a huge amount of time on stuff which isn't going to advance our interests or our objectives, isn't going to help anybody else very much, and also which we don't enjoy. Now, it's kind of silly, isn't it? And then there are other things which are where we feel which we're in the zone, as it were. We are so absorbed in what we're doing that time passes very quickly. We're very fulfilled. We feel that we're being creative, or we feel that we're adding some value. We feel that we're maybe in a loving relationship and that it's just wonderful. There are those times when it's almost ecstatic, and it's not a very great insight really to say, well, if you make a list of things that you really enjoy doing and which are wonderful, useful to other people and stretch your intellect and maybe make money or reinforce your health, and things which are not on that list, and then you say, well, how much time do I spend on those? And then you discover that at work, probably only a very small fraction of your time is really spent doing stuff which can be unbelievably valuable. And most of the time at work, and it doesn't matter whether you're a chief executive or a junior executive or someone that's being trained, most of the time actually we do stuff which somebody else could do, which is a relatively low-level thing. And yet there are very few people who say things like, well, I don't believe that going to this meeting is going to actually help me or anybody else very much, and I'm not going to come. And of course, right. People can't do that because, you're looking at a power structure in a company and all the rest of it. But even the people who have total discretion over their time, they do end up doing things which their peers do, even though they know in their heart of hearts that they're not very valuable. So, the whole point about the 80-20 principle is that it says in any particular thing that you consider, divide it into the things which are very, very productive and the things that are not very productive, and compare it to something which is an input. The input might be money, the input might be time, the input might be the extent to which you enjoy something. But basically, you're always trying to look at the things where you get a fantastic outcome for very little input. And so that's the way that we can be 100 times happier or more effective. And if you can grasp that concept, first of all, you can actually make some decisions. And decisions are some of the things that people don't make, but should make. There are few turning points in your life. They are the decision, for example, to marry or to engage in a long-term relationship with someone, the decision to take a particular job, the decision to go to a particular educational establishment, the decision to live in a particular place, or as you've done, to live in a foreign country. All of those decisions are going to affect your life in an unbelievable way. And yet, how much time and thought do we devote to those decisions? And more important, the really important decisions are often the ones that we just don't take. So, I think just taking decisions is an area where you could apply 80-20 thinking to. And, that's what I try and do. But the interesting thing, Eugene, is that even I, who've written all these books about 80-20, I don't actually keep to it very much either. It's very difficult to avoid the social pressures and the habits which we fall into, the obligations which we think we have to other people, the willingness to accept as friends or collaborators people who we actually don't really think are that great, and so on and so forth. So it's a very unusual person who actually manages to live the 80-20 way or whatever, but it's a very happy and liberated person. So it is something that I think everyone should think about. And even if you don't do the full 10 yards or whatever of that, even if you only do it for a particular part of your life, I think it can change things quite dramatically.
Yeah. And I think there's this obsession with busyness, is there not? And
absolutely.
That if one is busy, one is being productive, but that's a real facade. It's not the reality. And I think it's been said, busyness has become the new stupid.
Yeah, I think that's true. But why do we do that? I think one of the reasons we do that is that there's a primal fear of loneliness in relationships and also in work and all the rest of it. People are not happy not doing anything, and therefore they do things which fill the gaps, as it were. But the gaps then become the great majority of the time. I do think that, again, it takes a lot of discipline to say, I'm not going to do this unless it's incredibly productive or unless I'm enjoying it a huge amount, and just stop. And then you say, well, stop. What am I going to do then? Well, maybe you can think about something that you could do, which would be better. People just don't think. This is true of myself as well. People just don't think to the extent that they should do. They don't plan their day. Yeah. They don't think about what their objectives are for the day or the week or whatever. You can take it too far, but equally you can just drift through, following what the routines that you've always had, the conventions that other people follow, and the things that you absolutely have to do, even though you don't want to do them because you get paid to do them or because they're expected by someone who's got some degree of personal power over you. So yes, we just need to stop and think.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the classics, by Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. I think he was asked once, why do people succeed or do not succeed? And his response was, people do not think. And I think that's what we're saying, isn't it? We need some time out and actually stand back and observe and think about what it is that is important that will actually move the needle.
Yes, and it's not just the time thinking, it's also the intensity with which you want something, which I think is very important. I'm a great believer in the power of the unconscious mind, and that I believe is sort of, one of the great illustrations of 80-20, even though I didn't mention it in my first book, which is, what goes on the surface is not actually the majority of the creativity which we exhibit or the ideas which we have or the power which we could have, that all resides in the unconscious, which is a sort of, massive collation of all the experiences that we've had, all the things that we've thought, all the things we've learnt from other people, and all stuff that seems to come from outside as a download from heaven, as it were. I'm not talking about a really supernatural process, but just something where we feel inspired. Those things come from the unconscious, and yet they're not activated unless we really want something. And I think one of the problems of modern life is, most people 100 years ago wanted to survive. They wanted to make enough money to eat, maybe to have a home and so on and so forth. It was actually quite a simple world. Now, because we live in a world of unimaginable prosperity relative to 100 years ago, we don't necessarily have to think that there's a particular objective. Now, of course, there should be higher objectives, Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all that sort of stuff. We should be self-actualizing, but in a sense we don't need to, and so we can operate at a much lower level. The whole point is that the power of the unconscious doesn't come into effect unless we intensely want something, unless we're, very, in the old phrase, very ambitious. And the fact is that there are very few people, again, this is an 80-20 or 99-1 phenomenon, that there's probably only 1% of the work population that really is hugely ambitious. Well, it's not surprising that 1% might produce 80% or 99% of the results, because they intensely want something and they're using all of the power which they have from the unconscious mind. And that operates when they're asleep, it operates, when they're exercising, it operates when they're shaving or whatever. So again, that's one of the things that I think is very important from an
and really focusing on those few things that really matter, and it's the fractal nature of it, in that you have these feedback loops of that are positive and reinforcing, self-reinforcing. I think that's really what it comes down to, is doing more of what works well and gives you the pleasure or the benefits that you're seeking and so forth, kind of self-perpetuates itself.
It's a compounding process, isn't it? It's like putting money in the bank and getting interest on it, and but the interest rate is very high. So I think that's absolutely right. Unless you're really interested and curious about something, you're not going to discover something new. But if you really are interested and curious about something, then you just go deeper and deeper and deeper into that particular hole, and you end up, if you're lucky, you end up inventing something, whether it's the theory of relativity or whether it's Harry Potter or whatever it is that you invent, you end up inventing something which changes people's lives. And that comes from, being very, very deep in thinking about whatever it is that you want to think about.
All right. Turning to SuperConnect, which you and Greg Lockwood, you had the observation that what makes networking succeed is not the strong links of pre-existing contact that people may have, but rather the weak links of random encounters that really create new opportunities and career changes, entrepreneurial ventures and such. I think there's really, what I'm working on quite a bit these days is the whole drone ecosystem that is up and coming, and there it's really about getting many different players to come together. We used to kind of compete in the verticals, but now it's really competition in the horizontals, where you have different ecosystems being created and actually competing with one another. Is that a fair extrapolation from what the SuperConnect kind of thesis was all about?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, the point is that new knowledge comes from putting together old knowledge, but old knowledge of different types. And so therefore, unless you have the ability to tap into something that might be apparently completely irrelevant that someone else has learned, but you'd find out that they're actually doing it. They've discovered this little technique, or they discovered this idea, or they have this process of working, or whatever. And then you think, well, actually, that could be highly relevant in my sphere, which is a million miles away. The point is that you need to talk to people who are not like you. And that is so profoundly hard for human beings to do, except people who are very superficial. So the people who you really want to be talking to are not your extroverts who will talk to anyone in the supermarket queue, or the people that they sit next to on a plane, and therefore ruin the journey for that other passenger. The people you actually want to talk to are the people who don't perhaps really want to talk to anybody, but they are people who are thinking deeply about something, and so therefore it's a good idea. It's a very good idea to try and schedule and do this artificially. You know, who are the contacts from a previous life, a previous job, maybe college, maybe somewhere where you used to live, and you're hundreds of miles, thousands of miles away from them. Maybe someone whose political and social philosophy is almost the opposite of yours. You know, why don't you actually, if you have an excuse, to sit down with that person for a cup of coffee or a drink or whatever, and just ask them, you know, what's been exciting, what have they learned in the last 5 or 10 years, which they think is very important for them. You can often come up with really, really great ideas, and it's a very enjoyable process as well. I mean, you might take 10 of those meetings before you actually have a eureka moment, but it will happen on a big or a small scale. And the great thing about it in competitive terms is that almost nobody does it. I mean, I've written the book. I don't do it very often, actually. And I don't know anybody who does, really, apart from, as I say, the people who will never learn because they're more interested in broadcasting than in listening.
Receiving, yeah. And another very interesting insight that I read in your 80-20 individual book, 80-20 Revolution and the Rise of Individualism, I think that's really playing out today with a lot of people kind of tuning out to kind of the corporate rat race, if you will, and saying, okay, well, is there more to life, and is there something that I would rather do and make a go of it as an entrepreneur? What advice would you have for people like that who perhaps in their 50s, perhaps even later, 60s even, venture out on their own after having had the corporate life, if you will?
I think one of the things that I would say was as a background to that is that it is so much easier to start a business today, and even to start a business that's going to survive and prosper, than it was 10 or 20 years ago. You need far less money for a start because there are so many enabling processes that didn't exist 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. The internet's one of them. Obviously, things like the access to YouTube and the access to something like a platform like the iPhone, etc. It just makes it so much easier to get yourself in front of people and to make a pitch to people at relatively low cost and at relatively low capital, so that someone who has some savings, can do it. They don't necessarily have to sell their soul to a venture capitalist, which is, generally an awful experience if I'm quite honest about it. So therefore, it's much easier. The terms of trade have moved in favour of the individual. You don't need to do everything in the dreadful phrase that the value chain. You can buy in services from specialists and so on and so forth. So I would say that whereas you might not have thought of doing something 20 or 30 or 40 years ago because it was too risky or too expensive, or because you didn't want to go into debt or whatever, it's often much easier to do that today. And in a way, if you don't do it and you've got something that you want to do which you think could be a viable business, whether it's a sole trader business or whether it's something where you actually seriously want to make, hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars or whatever, it doesn't matter, because it's the same thing, as you say, it's fractal. It's the same pattern time and time again. What you're doing is trying to come up with an idea and a method of execution which will work, and a business formula which will actually make money. And you're trying to do that in a field that nobody has come to before. And it's quite easy. If you read my book, The Star Principle, you see that there are ways of dividing markets and finding gaps in the market. And sometimes there isn't a big enough market in the gap, but sometimes there is. And, there's a procedure which you can go through for saying, where is there unoccupied territory? So, for example, where could you do something that appeals to a particular set of customers? And I always use the example here of my betting company, Betfair, where that wasn't my idea. It was an idea of a guy called Bert Black, who had been a professional gambler and was really pissed off with the idea that it was only bookmakers who could actually allow people to bet. He said, well, why can't you do it in an electronic market where people who have a particular view about which team is going to win a football game or whatever, or people who, a horse that's going to win a race or whatever, why can't you propose the bet to somebody else and say, I will stand this bet because I don't think this is going to happen, or this is going to happen. So that was the idea. It was a brilliant idea, but in a way, he was segmenting the betting market into those people who were serious about gambling, just like he'd been a professional gambler, and those people who were not. It's almost impossible to make money if the bookmakers take away 10% of each transaction. It's 3 times worse than going to a casino, because if you bet on roulette, you have a 1 in 36 chance, or 1 in 37 chance actually, of winning, and you get paid out at odds which are 1% less than that. So you basically pay 3% to the house. And if you've ever been to a casino and played roulette for very long, you know that you're going to run out of money. So, but it's 3 times worse than that if bookmakers take 10%, and on some things they take 20%. Well, you can't do that. But if you're in a situation where the facilitating entity, which was Betfair or another electronic betting exchange, was taking 1% or 2%, then you only had to be, as it were, 52nd percentile or 53rd percentile inability to predict results in a particular narrow sphere, which you can choose. And so you ended up with a situation where there were a lot of people who previously would have wanted to be professional gamblers and had the contacts, the imagination and the judgment to do that, but they just couldn't do it because of the structure of the market. So you created a whole new wave of gambling and a whole new wave of possibility for people who actually wanted to exercise their judgment and wanted to make money from it, either from the selecting what was going to win or lose, but also trading, being able to predict which way the market was going to go, and then you can reverse the bet and make a profit, whatever happens in the event. So, it was in a way, it was something, and this is what I think is a very generic thing. It doesn't apply just to gambling, it applies to everything. If there's something that you would like to do, but the structure of the market doesn't allow it, so analogously for Bert Black, he couldn't exercise that. There was no electronic market, so he had to go to bookmakers, and he knew that going to bookmakers was a mug's game. But if you could actually change the structure of the market and therefore be able to do something that you wanted to do, then you set up the mechanism for other people to be able to do that. You obviously have to believe that there are enough people like you to actually make a go out of it. But it's a good way of thinking about what it is. Or you can take a more abstract approach and say, well, there's this market today, there's a car market. If we went back, I don't know, to the 1920s or something like that, you say, well, actually, there are these markets for cars. There's Ford and there's General Motors and there's Chrysler, etc. But I'm going to specialize in 4x4s, or I'm going to specialize in sports vehicles. I'm going to specialize in very high performance things, or I'm going to specialize in stuff that's really cheap and cheerful. The possibilities for segmenting markets that are growing are almost endless, and they're very well described. I mean, they are generic, and yet in certain markets those extra segments just don't exist. So it's not a very difficult job, and it's quite an exciting job to try and think, well, where might there be a new segment which I could create? It has to have new types of customers that you're appealing to who are different from the average. It has to have economics for you which enable you to make some money, and it has to deliver some extra value to the people concerned. But it's not impossible. In fact, in almost any sphere, the number of opportunities which are taken up versus the number of theoretical opportunities is very minuscule. There's a lot more room for entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is that which advances society because it makes better products or cheaper products. It makes the process of buying simpler. For example, you get, via Amazon rather than having to go to the high street. You basically add richness. You add products like the iPhone that never existed before, and you also make it possible for people to get better value for money. So, I mean, Uber is about half the price of a black cab in London, and the result of that is that wherever Uber has become important, San Francisco and many other cities, it has enlarged the market for taxis, I suppose you'd call them, something like 3 times, 10 times or something like that. And that's an enormously valuable thing to do. That's the thing which advances the wealth of society. That's the thing that creates growth. But it's also something which pleases customers and also enables the entrepreneur to make a lot of money and to, have a very interesting life. So, entrepreneurship relies upon individuality. Individuality is something which is not in short supply. But there's latent individuality, and all of us actually need to accentuate our individuality and create a sphere where we're not the best in that particular area, but we're the only person doing it.
All right. No, that's very, very powerful and very, very true. And like you say, I think the internet has really enabled a lot of this to happen faster, more efficiently, if you will, as well. But the tools are there for people to make a go of it, for sure. Well, very, very interesting. Your next work, How to Be Unreasonably Successful. You had mentioned.
Yes, give me a trailer. Give me a trailer for that. That's great.
What can we expect?
You could expect a unique book. I won't say where it's going to be absolutely fantastic, although I believe that it will be. But there will not be a book that you have read which is like this, because I have taken the view that I needed to combine a business perspective with a historical perspective. So I've looked at about 20 people actually selected from a larger list, obviously about 100 people, who I think were far more successful in life than in a sense they deserved to be, and hence the title Unreasonably Successful. Uh-huh. So you might take someone like Madonna as an example of that, and I hope that I'm not going to get sued when I say that, in my opinion, I have to say it's my opinion, Madonna has, she's got good competent skills. She's actually, I think she's a good songwriter. I think she's a good singer, etc., etc. But she has added to that this sort of, sex idol perspective, and she has gone into so many different areas where the whole objective of each project is to keep her face and her performance in the public face. And, I think in some ways she's a bit like Donald Trump, but that you might not want to hear about Madonna, but you ain't got no choice. And, so she has taken what I think are pretty ordinary talents and leveraged them by a very clever strategy, and all credit to her for that. So maybe she does deserve that. But, she has been fantastically successful. However, in remaining one of the people that's most well known in popular entertainment for decades, and that's very, very rare. And she's made an awful lot of money as well. So someone like her, for example, or at the other extreme, Winston Churchill, a guy who was a consistent and utter failure through life, and I sort of list all the failures that he, or most of the serious ones anyway, that he engaged in, including causing huge casualties in Gallipoli in the First World War, and before that trying to put an army of people into Antwerp to stop the Germans taking Antwerp, and so on and so forth. And everything that he did was a failure, and yet the guy had got a strategy and he got a view of life. And eventually he lucked out, or the world lucked out, because he realised what a threat Adolf Hitler was. And, nobody listened to him for 7 or 8 years, and then everybody had to listen to him because everything that he said about Hitler turned out to be true, and nobody had believed it beforehand. So that's an extraordinary thing. And then he, basically walked with destiny, as he termed it. He was a fantastic warlord, despite being incredibly incompetent. And in some ways, I think that to take a modern political analogy, that Boris Johnson is much the same of the same ilk, because he had a fantastic strategy in the last British general election, which happened last week. But before that, he was a total failure. His own campaign manager decided that halfway through the election previously for Conservative leader, that he, in 2015 I think it was, that he was not suited to be Prime Minister. So Michael Gove said, I can't support this man, even though I'm his campaign manager. He then became the Foreign Secretary, and was probably the worst Foreign Secretary in British history. But he appears to be a fantastically successful Prime Minister, and he's got the right job because it suits his particular philosophy, and it suits the strategy which he has adopted, and it suits his attitudes as well. All of these people, I have isolated 9 things that I think made them successful, and they weren't necessarily things which they themselves devised or were responsible for. So for one example, nearly all of these people, or in fact, I think I'm right in saying every single one of them, had a transforming experience in their life before they became successful. And if they had not had that transforming experience, we'd never have heard of them. So, to take a business example, Jeff Bezos invented Amazon, but actually he didn't. He worked for a company called D.E. Shaw and Company, which was a quantitative hedge fund based in New York, but realized that the internet was going to be hugely important in the early 1990s before almost anybody realized it. And so Bezos joined this firm, and he worked very closely with David Shaw, who was the founder, the eponymous D.E. Shaw. And Shaw had this idea, which was developed with Bezos, for the everything store on the internet. And of course, it became Amazon. But, if and I'm not saying that Jeff didn't actually strongly help to devise the plan, and then he, of course, went and made it real, which is always 9/10 of the issue. But if he hadn't have happened to go to a headhunter one day, I think in 1992 or something like that, he was about to leave Wall Street, disillusioned with that. The headhunter said, look, this is a different sort of Wall Street firm. Why don't you go and see David Shaw? And the rest is history. That was an experience which made Bezos hundreds of times more effective. And if he hadn't have had that experience, we would probably not have heard of him. And every single person in this book had some experience like that. And the point is that it was, in almost all cases, accidental. It wasn't something that was planned by the individual. It wasn't something even which was desired by the individual. It's something that happened to them. Now, my argument is that if you realize that a transforming experience is necessary for unreasonable success, you better ask yourself whether you've had one. And if you haven't had one, then you can begin to engineer it, which is something that none of those people actually had the benefit of, because they weren't thinking about how important it was to have a transforming experience. And as I say, there are 9 of these different landmarks. And if people want to, I'm not saying that, you read the book and then you become a billionaire, but if you read the book and then actually say that you do want to be unreasonably successful, which requires a different mindset and requires you to make certain sacrifices, and perhaps out of 100 readers there might be 95 people who say, no, I don't want to do that. But if you're one of the 5% that does, I'm not saying that you stand a chance of I'm not saying that you're certain to become unreasonably successful. I am saying that the chances of you doing it go up by a fantastic amount. And so I think it's a very, very helpful book. But most of the book is stories of famous people, or not famous people actually, and how they made it, because they actually, as I put it, visit these 9 landmarks. And apart from anything else, I enjoyed writing the book enormously. It's a book I've enjoyed writing by far the most, and I hope that people will enjoy reading it. So that's the commercial, the ad for the ad for my book, and I think we've run out of time.
But it also says that one needs to go through some suffering. You talk about transformative experience, and ultimately also you need to be adaptable, agile.
Yeah, there are some attitude things that I mean. One of the things that is also extremely interesting is that all of these people had really major setbacks in their career, and so that in many cases they were on the verge of giving up, or they decided to do something different, which might have been the right decision anyway. But suffering is necessary. And I remember someone once said to me in my mid-20s, the problem with you, Richard, is that you've never suffered. You've never had a serious setback in your career. It's just been sort of, one great thing after another. And unless you have a serious setback, you're not going to really be successful. You might be mildly successful, but you need that. And then 2 or 3 years later, I was working at the Boston Consulting Group and sort of virtually got fired. So that was a bit of a setback, but it was enormously helpful. And so, I would say to anyone that's suffering a huge setback at the moment, whether it's personal, psychological, business related, or whatever, rejoice, because actually, that will make it possible for you to really make things in the future. It might be deeply unpleasant, but it's a springboard for the future if you understand that.
So the cloud has a silver lining, if you will.
The cloud has more than a silver lining. The cloud disguises those sunlit uplands which are coming. And indeed, it's true, isn't it? And I'm looking out at the weather here, and it's pouring the rain. But I know that tomorrow it's going to be sunny, and it will be so much nicer because everything's green and so forth. So yes, life works out one way or another.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Richard, I think we've come to the 1 hour. It's been a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to your new book. When is it coming out?
June next year, June 2020. How to Be Unreasonably Successful, published by Little Brown in the UK and by Entrepreneur Press in the US. And it's the first time I've ever managed to persuade the US and the non-US publishers to produce the book on the same day. So in June, everybody can have access to this wonderful book.
Available on Amazon, I take it? Or?
Oh yes, it will be available everywhere. Anyway, I apologise to anyone listening to the podcast for the commercial. I find that quite deeply distasteful. But I tell you, read the book. You'll benefit.
Great, Richard. Thank you very much for the time again. It's been a real honor. Hope to have another opportunity at some point. And I'm, as I build my business as well, it's really an interesting time for sure for a lot of people of my age. A lot of folks looking at what's the next step, what's in their journey of life, if you will. So I think you're your books and insights have been really welcome for me and for others as well.
Eugene, thank you very much. I thought your questions are great and absolutely the right note to finish on. Ever onward and upward, however bleak life appears to be, it can be 100 times better.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll look forward to hearing more of you.
Thanks, Eugene. Bye-bye.
Bye now.